Hello and good afternoon. I'm Tracy Gordon, Acting Director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to a conversation about the challenges and opportunities facing state governments post-COVID-19. As my colleague Lucy Dedayan has pointed out, states collected about 2% less in major taxes from April to December of 2020 compared to 1 year earlier. This was better than many state revenue estimators predicted when the economy was contracting at an annualized rate of 32% in the spring of 2020. Nevertheless, as my colleague Richard Oxher has pointed out, and Richard will be joining us later today, many states are still climbing back from where they thought they would be a year before the pandemic hit. Into this mix, we have about $350 billion that looks like it will be approved by the House again, and so more coming federal aid, but continued uncertainty about the pace of vaccinations, new COVID strains, and a nascent but unequal economic recovery. We are very fortunate today to have some excellent speakers to come and address these topics in a keynote conversation followed by a panel discussion. In a moment, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Kim Rubin, to kick things off, but for now, some quick housekeeping. This virtual event is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. Speaker biographies are available at urban.org. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button on Zoom. All participants are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions or comments using the Q&A box at any time. And we encourage everyone in the audience to continue today's conversation by sharing your thoughts or observations on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Now here's my colleague, Kim Rubin. Kim is Saul Price Fellow of the Tax Policy Center and Director of the State and Local Finance Initiative at the Urban Institute. And she'll be introducing our keynote conversation guest, Governor Jared Polis.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome. I am honored to be sharing the stage today with the Governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, and we're going to have a brief conversation about what things look like in the state. Governor Polis, welcome.
Hey, Kim, how are you? Good to see you.
I am good. Good to see you. About a year ago, I got to see you in person in the lovely state of Colorado, and now we're on Zoom.
And you will again, And I just want to thank you and the Urban Institute for all the great work. And Urban Institute has been so helpful in a lot of our tax reform work, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. It's been our pleasure. And thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about how things are going in Colorado. So to start, how are things in Colorado today?
Well, I think like most places, we're getting the disease under better control, rapidly vaccinating folks. We achieved our benchmark of successfully vaccinating more than 70% of people aged 70 and up by the end of February. I think we're well over 3/4 now. Currently, anybody 60 and up can get the vaccine. We're just a week or two away from going to age 50 and up. So that's going well. However, to put well in perspective, as you know, America's lost over 500,000 lives. Colorado's lost close to 6,000 lives. We had a very somber memorial service at our state capitol a couple of evenings ago, where we recognized the great loss that our state and our nation and the world have had this past year, as we really seek to build back stronger and better than before. And we're thrilled to partner with the federal government with regards to the upcoming additional stimulus to help make sure that we have a robust and equitable recovery.
Right. And so you just had your State of the State address and had released your budget plan in November. It restored some of the funding you had cut earlier when we didn't know how bad things would be. Can you tell us a little bit about your priorities for next year's budget and your stimulus plan?
Yeah, so we highlighted several of priorities in the state budget. We've also been working with our legislature on $1 billion state stimulus plan from one-time carry forward funds that we have available, shovel-ready infrastructure, jobs that are ready today, building a lasting legacy of benefit for our future, good ROI. So we have a number of projects that meet that categorization, and we're looking forward to finalizing those details with the legislature.
Great. One of the things I really liked in your plan is the fact that parts of it are targeted at families and residents that seem to have been hardest hit in the pandemic. This includes the $375 checks you sent out late last year for unemployed workers. And so can you tell us more about what your priorities are for these families?
So we know that relief money is also highly stimulative in that it gets spent, it's sent back out into the economy. So we did during the federal gap when they couldn't quite get together that second bill, we did a one-time $375 payment to every Coloradan who had experienced any degree of unemployment during any part of the crisis, about 400,000 Coloradans. We also, working with our state ledge in a special session, did renter relief, food bank money, additional help for small businesses, both through grants and loans and tax relief. And we're looking to continue those with the next round of stimulus.
Great. And I'm guessing you're able to breathe a little easier given the federal relief package is in the process of being passed. I think they're talking about it in the House right now, and hopefully it'll be law by the end of the week. Unlike the last two bills, it does seem like it's going to include money targeted to state and local governments. How will this additional aid help you in your efforts going forward?
We are glad that it includes local government. Frankly, out of the last one, we ourselves shared it with local governments, the right thing to do. So we're glad that they're written into the bill. And we will look forward to, of course, hopefully having the maximum flexibility. I think there's going to be a lot because of some of the Senate amendments. There's a little bit less flexibility than we'd like. Hopefully, when the agencies implement it through rule, we're certainly hoping for the greatest degree of flexibility with that, so we can put it to the highest and best use in our great state of Colorado.
Great. And if we turn our focus a little bit, you've talked a little bit about your public health numbers. And so if we talk about public health and economic conditions within the state, as you mentioned before, Colorado's numbers are pretty good compared to a lot of the other states. Your case numbers are low, your vaccine administration seems to be pretty high. So things seem to be going in the right direction. Can you talk a little bit about what your priorities are and what's next in terms of public health and where you're going and what?
Yeah, we've had a big focus from the day we got the first vaccine on getting it into arms, and we've always been in the sort of top tier states doing that. We implemented a rule where every partner we work with has to use every dose we give them within 3 days, or we reassign it to another partner, because we know that that's the path back to economic prosperity, to continuing opening, to getting cases down, to saving lives, all of those things. Right now, the economy everywhere is delicate, obviously still. Our tourism sector hasn't come back as much as we'd like. At least we don't operate cruise ships, thank goodness, out of Colorado. That's going to be even harder. But our ski resorts are doing fine, but not, they're down. They're hanging in there. And part of that was we had weak snow early in the year. We now have good snow. So come on out to Colorado. We have great snow in Vail and Aspen and Breckenridge and Copper Mountain and Winter Park, all of our Steamboat, our great world-class resorts. But we all know that international travel, which is certainly a big segment of that, which are high spenders, has trickled to almost zero. So we've people are just not traveling internationally. We are getting the domestic travel base, but it's still off a bit. And of course, Coloradans are going out on the slopes on a regular basis. But economically, we rely on attracting people from across the world, and that slowed down a little.
Okay. And so if we continue talking about economic conditions, where do you see things in 6 months or a year? And when do you think we might be at a point that's sort of comparable to where you were back last March?
So, different sectors, different impact, right? Like this has had next to zero impact on sort of our aerospace sector. Tourism has had a major impact. I think tourism will be back in spades. I think there's people with the money and the pent up cabin fever that are just ready to come to Colorado, and probably other places too, but we hope Colorado, and frankly, Coloradans that are ready to, go to the beaches somewhere too. So I really think there's pent up demand. I think a lot of that will hit this summer. People have the money, they're safe, they feel safe because they have the vaccine, they've gotten it. They're getting, especially folks in, again, 60s, 70s. Those are the big spenders. Discretionary income, much more than people in their 20s and 30s, and they've been the most cautious, the most timid, rightfully so, because of the health impact of the virus. So as they get vaccinated, I think that consumer confidence will return.
Okay, great. And one of the things that seems to be of concern are schools. So can you say a little bit about what your plans are and when you think students and teachers will be able to return to the classroom?
They're back in Colorado, pretty much everywhere. Obviously, if there's an outbreak at a site, they have to take, that class goes online for 10 days. for quarantine. But we made it a major priority to get our schools back for a number of reasons. Obviously, first and foremost, learning loss, especially are most at risk to be able to achieve academically. But it's more than that. It's also about a workforce. It's about gender equity in the workforce. We see nationally the lowest participation of women in the workforce since 1985. A big part of that is schools not being in session in person. So we focused last year. We had a back to school task force. We included teachers and parents and school administrators and many others. And pretty much every district in Colorado is in person. There's still some high schools that are 2 days a week, but the K-8 is pretty much all back full time.
All right, and they're able to go to class and see their friends and.
Yeah, in a safe way, right? With layered protections. We work very hard on the protection protocols, mask wearing, cohorting, symptom checking, quarantines when necessary. Our teachers have essentially all been vaccinated, those that want it. So, at least kids are getting that tail part of the year in person, which is so important.
Great. And so is there anything else you'd like to cover that we haven't?
I would just say that we've had many school districts in Colorado that have been in person all year and have gone very well. And so that's actually a majority of our school districts have been full in person all year. But like a lot of areas, our larger metropolitan districts and some of our larger suburban districts have been a little bit slower. So they've mostly been back since January, sort of on and off last fall. They some of them were hybrid, but now they're generally back, which is exciting for the kids and the families. And especially as the increases in vaccinations occur, we can see the end of this in sight. So I think late summer will be close to normal. Early summer, there's still folks getting vaccinated. Hopefully everybody who wants it can get it in May, which means immunity by the end of June.
Great. That's great. And so is there anything else you'd like to cover about your budget or what's going on in the school?
I would just say the challenge with the budget is really putting one-time stimulus funds to the highest and best use. And that's challenging. How do we create jobs today, have a stimulative effect today, but also create a lasting legacy, a lasting benefit from the money? Transportation, shovel-ready projects, infrastructure, parks expansion, things that you don't just burn and lose, but that create a lasting competitive advantage for the state.
Okay, I think that is great. And I know you have somewhere else you're supposed to be. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and good luck in everything that goes next. And I hope it all keeps going.
Yeah, thank you. And we certainly appreciate ideas from the Urban Institute about, use of one-time stimulus funds. I think that would be very helpful to get out to governors across the country to see what you think, based on the metrics, are some of the highest and best uses of those funds.
Great. And we're happy to share that. Again, I just sort of want to reiterate that what you did for unemployed workers. So the things where you're targeting the money at people who are like the most hurt by COVID felt like really smart policy. And, where we see other states doing that, we're really happy. So, California, Maryland, you're doing similar things in terms of targeting people on unemployment or with the EITC.
Yeah, the federal aid, as you know, is not highly targeted. Shall we say, the $1,400, to put it diplomatically. And perhaps they could have done more for those who are more affected at a lower total price tag and a better stimulative effect. So I think none of us really know what kind of middle class, upper middle class families with an extra $1,400 are going to do. They'll probably just stick it in the bank, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and you have a great rest of your day. And now we're going to change focus a little bit, and I'm going to turn things over to Richard Oxier, a senior policy associate with us here at the Tax Policy Center and the State and Local Finance Initiative. Richard will have a conversation with budget officials from Kentucky and Ohio. He'll also introduce them as they begin. Richard?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kim. And many thanks to Governor Polis for joining us for that great conversation. I am now joined by two more budget leaders. One of the very small silver linings of this pandemic is that instead of just hosting an event in Washington, we're joined by the governor of Colorado, and now I'm talking with two budget leaders, Kimberly Murnix from Ohio. She is the director of Ohio's Office of Management Budget, and John Hicks, who is the budget director for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. One thing I'm excited about, talking to people in their home states as you're literally working on the budget, thank you so much for giving us your time because I know it is in short supply, is to focus on something that's really important, which is that the pandemic and the economic downturn, it looks a lot different in different states. And so, Kim, if you get us started, and maybe just give an introduction of what should we know about Ohio, what should we know about Ohio's budget, and how has the pandemic and economic downturn affected both?
Sure. Good afternoon, Richard, and great question. Very happy to be here with you this afternoon. As you know, Ohio is a large state with a diversity of community types. We have urban areas, big C's, Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. We have several other urban areas like Toledo and Akron. We also have small towns and rural communities as well. So a very diverse set of communities. We are also just a large economy, 7th largest economy among states, 21st largest economy in the world. And so while our economy has become quite diverse in recent years, we have many more tech companies, for example, we still have a very large modern manufacturing base. And so I would say the pandemic has affected the different parts of Ohio, the different communities or different economies differently. At the very onset of the global pandemic, Ohio was experiencing solid continued growth. Our state budget was likewise on very solid ground. In fact, I was looking back at my notes a couple of weeks ago from a year ago, and on February 6th in my briefing with Governor DeWine, I had noted that our budget was strong, revenues were well ahead of estimate at that point in the fiscal year, 8 months in. But I noted that we were watching coronavirus, the new coronavirus in China and Asia. It was on our radar. But at that point, our biggest thought was that it could disrupt manufacturing supply chains, could disrupt production and impact our economy. But a month later, fast forward from February to March of last year, it became quite clear that the virus would have a much larger impact and dramatic impact across the state. And in fact, March 9th, today, is the 1-year anniversary since our first confirmed case in Ohio. So, how did it affect our state budget? We were up at the end of March of last year by about $250 million ahead of estimate. Over the next few months during the onset of the pandemic, that was washed away. We had about $1 billion turn in our revenues just in that short 3 to 4 month time frame. So, but we acted quickly. We contained the virus, we mitigated the impact, focused on saving lives. We ensured that our hospitals were not overwhelmed. And I would say, communication was key in those very early days.
Awesome. So Kim, I want to underline 2 things that you said that I think are just really important for the audience to keep in mind throughout this proposal. The first is, you talked about the diversity of Ohio, because I think it's great how that mirrors kind of the nation with both urban and rural centers, and how this pandemic and how you respond to it differs so much depending on who you are and where you are and what you do. And the second is that if we were having this conversation in January of 2020, it would have been a really upbeat conversation. People would talk about how large their rainy day funds are, because they were at record highs. They were talking about all the new programs that we were going to start, all the tax revenues coming in without having to raise taxes. And 12, 13, 14 months later, it's a completely different conversation. And so one thing in Ohio, you not only are putting together a budget, but Governor DeWine has his Investing in Ohio initiative. And so how did you simultaneously think about how are you going to do your normal responsibilities as a budget director, but also craft a special package aimed at addressing the pandemic?
Sure. So Ohio is on a biennial budget. So the onset of the pandemic was in the tail end of the first year of the biennium. So we've made it through, and we are now in the process of enacting our next 2-year budget. And given where we are in the pandemic, and given the one-time resources that we have, both state resources and federal government stimulus, we are able to surge investments to our communities, to our community infrastructure, to broadband, which is key, has proven to be an area where we have focused even prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic showed us and really showed the world how critical broadband is for education, for job searches, for telehealth. All of those factors went into how we built our economic plan to focus on broadband and ensuring that all of our citizens have access. We also have focused that Investing in Ohio initiative on the businesses, on our industries that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. So it's $1 billion package that is focused on ensuring that Ohio is on the best footing possible to lead in the recovery, to come out stronger than we were even before the pandemic. We were, as you said, we were experiencing strong, steady growth. We know that we can do even better going forward.
Mhm. So while you and Governor DeWine are juggling all this and trying to expand broadband and ensure that businesses get the relief they need, one thing that your state hasn't done, and kind of in a little contrast to others, is not dipped into its rainy day funds. Can you talk about that decision, just in terms of like what went into making that decision last year when we were in the middle of this, and now maybe this year when you're able to look more towards the future? And what drove that decision, and what about Ohio's future drove that decision?
Sure. Well, here in Ohio, we are conservative first. So we tightened our belts. We reduced expenses even before turning to our savings, as you've mentioned. We looked at federal resources as ways as there so that we can handle the pandemic without needing to make the cost of the pandemic a burden on our state government, our taxpayer resources. So we are pleased that we've been able to protect our budget stabilization fund, our rainy day fund. That savings account is critical. It continues to be a critical backstop going forward. Should we need to access it, it provides us with that stability to know that we will be able to continue to provide services to citizens. As we enter into recovery, of course, there still remains a level of uncertainty. And again, just tightening our belts, making sure that we're conservative on expenses, looking at state government as the provider of services, but making sure that we led the way in maintaining that stable balance without having to drain all of our resources that are important to maintain for the future.
And before I kind of turn the floor over to John for a minute, just personally, because you're in charge of the state's budget, and I'm sure you had plans for what happens during the next recession. I know that was a topic at our office, or what are we going to do if this industry goes down or this ends up? And I'm guessing global pandemic was not on the list of possibilities. So just personally, has anything surprised you the most in the past year?
So it's an interesting question. We had a project in place looking ahead to when would the next downturn arrive? When would those just natural economic cycles, when would that affect our budget? As I said, we were experiencing very strong, steady growth, but there were some signs of weakening in 2019, but we and I think the rest of the country were coming out of that strong. I think the thing that most surprised me, and I think this is in a good way, is the amount of innovation that we packed into this year. The switch amongst state government from in-person to remote work really on a dime has shown us how we can be, I think, more flexible, more creative. And I think that may be a lasting part of our service and citizen-facing organization, that we can provide services differently, that we can be more creative and be flexible. So while a global pandemic wasn't really on the list, we always plan for the future. We I think it's important to keep those things in mind as we move forward. And going back to my history with state government, I spent some time at the Ohio Department of Education and was in education world during the last H1N1 flu pandemic. So having that experience kind of, it's always going to be a possibility. I don't think that anything like what we've experienced in the last year was on anyone's minds, but our emergency management folks always have a pandemic plan. And so we weren't, I don't want to give the impression that we were, unprepared for that eventuality. It's just, it has been more extreme than I think anyone had imagined. But we had a lot of good information from past experiences, good planning, good emergency reaction. And so we were able to activate those plans. And I think, in Ohio, get ahead of the pandemic very early, focus on saving lives, focus on protecting our citizens so that we can come out stronger on the other side. A big part of Governor DeWine's budget plan focuses on healthy people, renewing communities for a thriving economy. We know that we have to have healthy people in order to drive our economic resurgence. And so that is where our focus has been and where it will continue to be.
Absolutely. And so, John, bringing you in the conversation now, could you maybe do the same, but educate our audience a bit on the Commonwealth of Kentucky, just what the state's budget looked like and how the pandemic has affected it?
Yeah, sure, Richard. Hey, thank you, and thanks to the Urban Institute for this panel. Yeah, Kentucky, we're about a state that's 27th in population. We've got about a $12 billion general fund, which is about the median of all the 50 states. Our budget is a little higher in education spending and a little lower in Medicaid. And one of the reasons for that is because of our lower personal income, we get a larger share of federal dollars for that program, and a little lower on higher ed spending as a group of the general fund spending. But Kentucky has and has long had a pretty stable revenue structure. Under various measures, we've been ranked about second in least volatility of our revenue structure. And our economic situation, our employment, we're a higher than average goods producing manufacturing state. Also heavy in trades and transportation and utility. We're a big logistics state. We're just a little south of Kim in Ohio, but geographically situated well. And you'll probably see a lot of video on the United Parcel Service delivering vaccines out of Louisville and Shepherdsville, Kentucky. So that's a little bit of our kind of our economic mix. We're even though we're middle of the pack on population, we have a mix of rural and urban. Not quite the urbanity of a state of Ohio, but we're also I'll say a wide state like Tennessee. A lot of roadways going through Kentucky from east to west. But on the pandemic, our Governor Beshear came into office in December of 2019.
Right.
So here it is, almost 3+ months into it. March 6th, Kim mentioned March 9, was our first case, and the governor issued his first executive order, acted immediately to start to take mitigation measures, working with our health commissioner and all the experts on trying to figure out and understand how you can keep people safe and protect them, from the COVID virus. So we were very quick to act, as many governors were, seeking out the mitigation responsibilities, battling for personal protective equipment, as other states were. And we were very, very early in ramping up a testing protocol and the capability, and one of the results, of that over time is we've been we've got a fairly low mortality per capita in Kentucky from COVID-19, and we're pleased with that. But I will say economically, we were one of the quickest states to drop significantly in job numbers. The unemployment ranks, we kind of looking at them nationally, we went fast there. And part of that was the mitigation effort, particularly in the hospitality, tourism, retail, bars and restaurants. As a result, one of the things we also did to help contend with that, we were one of the fastest in getting people signed up for health insurance through Medicaid, those who lost their jobs. So our enrollment in Medicaid rose quickly compared to many other states. And that was an intentional policy decision, taking advantage of some of the flexibility the federal government provided that enabled us to do some quick sign up. So the governor was very concerned about, the ability for people to have access to health coverage, during a pandemic. And then we've been recovering on the economic side. We've recovered about half of those job losses. But we're really concerned about things, as Kim mentioned, the drop in labor force participation, particularly among women. It's twice the drop of men, across the country. Those are things we're looking at, concerned about. But let me talk about the budgetary impact. None of us knew how bad it was going to be. Mm-hmm. We were all very worried. We were in the budget conference committee between the two chambers, the House and the Senate, and COVID hit. And we're a biennial budget state too. And in fact, we were putting together our fiscal 21 and 22 budget. The governor had proposed it in early February. And then suddenly COVID hit, and the legislature understandably decided to just put a one-year budget together. And they took the pessimistic scenario of the revenue estimate, because we really didn't know how far it was going to fall. So we already had put together some scenarios. And so they put a very, basic conservative budget together to continue services, really fairly few cuts, but and then hoping. And so we turned around right after the session, and in May, tried to put together another revenue estimate, with a couple of months under our belt, and it came out really dire. We really, it was like a 4 to 5% decline in revenues, which may not sound dire, but that's pretty bad. And so we started planning for budget reductions, right, immediately as we were walking into the new fiscal year. So we were putting together some pretty dark scenarios in terms of what we might have to do to balance. But we also took our time and continued to watch. And then after, like in the fourth quarter of our fiscal year, the April through June period, we dropped 4.5% reduction in our revenues. Road fund revenues that include gas taxes dropped almost 24%. People clearly stopped driving. One of our main sources for your transportation infrastructure. So that was the condition. But we continued to watch, and once people, I think, became resolved on how they dealt with the mitigation, we started watching the revenues, and they were not falling like we thought they would. In the summer, particularly in June, we were one of the states where almost all of us delayed our tax filings from April to July, just like the federal government. In Kentucky, we chose to keep the books open and deposit those late filings into the old fiscal year. And so June came, and or July came, and those are big dollars in income tax states. And it turned out way better than we expected. Not only the returns, but the estimated payments, because that was a predictor for us about what the future might hold is individuals who were making estimated payments. And they rose, they didn't fall. And so that was an early indicator that maybe things on that side of the economic house weren't going to be so bad. As we moved through the fall, we continued to have positive growth, surprising positive growth, particularly in the sales tax. People were moving from buying services to buying tangible goods, and we taxed those things. And so we were fortunate that as we moved into the fall to recognize we may not have the bad revenue situation that we thought we would have, and that fourth quarter was a decline, but was not being repeated in subsequent times. So we felt very fortunate about that. And so those were, that's how we contended with it. And then we had to, move into putting another budget together, because we didn't do the 2-year budget. And so the governor, that was his, if you will, second budget in just a matter of months that he put together. And so we have a conservative revenue estimate that we're continuing to outperform. And I've seen that across the country in many states. We're doing better on revenues through this part of 8 months of the fiscal year than we thought even last spring. And so It's unintuitive though. There's economic pain out there. There's a lot of people unemployed, a lot of people worried about evictions and paying their utility bills, keeping up, small businesses that have closed. Main Street is hit, much harder than the online marketplaces, who have served to support a lot of our sales tax and our consumption. So those were some of the beginning, I'll say the contending things that we did. But from a fiscal side for a state government, it wasn't so bad. And so that's kind of proof that the greatest impact on people economically are those at the lower wage levels, lower income levels. Because clearly our income taxes they didn't get affected as badly as the unemployment rate and the labor force participation would show you. And also, people of middle and upper income continued to purchase, right? And Home Depot and the big box, they were moving the way that they were spending, but they were still spending. And so we have this surprising but fortunate situation to where our fiscal situation is much better than our broader economic situation.
Right. And you touched on this, and I think we'll just, because this is a group of state budget experts and an audience of state budget nerds, Kentucky is a biennial budget state, and then you had to, on a dime, change to an annual budgeting state. You talked about how Governor Beshear started in December, and so did you. And so what was that like, and how has that affected your ability to plan going forward? And you covered so much about the ups and downs, but did anything else kind of throw you for a loop, given how quickly you were thrown into this crisis?
Well, that part wasn't very hard for me, given that I've spent about 32 years, in the world of state budgeting. As all of us budget directors knows, governors gear up very quickly in the ability to make decisions during a budget process, and I think they enjoy that part of the process an awful lot. So we dug right back in. The governor had already produced a 2-year budget proposal in the months before. So really what we decided to do was to, see what are the circumstances that have changed. What do we need to adjust to in proposing a new budget? And so, like a number of states, what happened as a result of better revenues than expected, as a result of leveraging some of the CARES Act money, we came up with over $600 million in one-time funds that the governor has proposed to the legislature as kind of an assistant and investment program for small businesses and nonprofits, for broadband and school construction, for some economic development efforts, as well as repayment of our federal advance on our unemployment insurance loan. A number of things that really met the test of need right now, but also looking forward to investment. That was an unusual situation. So that threw me for a loop, that I could walk into a governor's office and say, here's what you can decide upon. And putting together a budget that has positive elements that in some ways allowed a state government to play the counter-cyclical role that the federal government plays in fiscal policy, that we could put to use some of these one-time monies, not sit on them. As the governor would say, we wanted to be FDR and not Herbert Hoover. We wanted to move forward with that. And so that was a real surprise and a fortunate situation. And he put a budget together that on an ongoing basis, because revenues were stable, for the first time since the Great Recession, it was a budget that Kentucky put forward that had no cuts in it. It was the first time that he was able to invest in post-secondary education since the Great Recession. He was able to continue his priorities in K-12 education and in healthcare and in children and families and good paying jobs and some infrastructure improvement. It was still a conservative budget in terms of spending increases, but we weren't moving backwards. We weren't having to go back and figure out what to cut. Here, it was a limited amount of what to invest in. So I was surprised by that. Budget directors are not always positive people when you look forward in time. It's our job to look at, what is the bad scenario and how do we contend with it. So that was a surprising situation for us, a good one. And now it's in the hands of our legislature because of our, we call it the short session in the every other year in states like Kentucky, they're nearing the end of the budget process. And so we're about a week away of knowing the final result.
Awesome. So Kim, And John, I'm going to throw out questions now. You both are big college basketball fans, so this is a toss-up. Just feel free to grab the ball from here on out. You've both done a really good job of getting it, something that I think it's so critical to convey and so challenging to convey, which is how different this downturn is affecting different people. If you're selling goods over the internet, your business might be booming right now. If you opened a restaurant in the middle of a city, you might sadly had to have closed down. If you're a high income worker who's worked from home and has money in the stock market, your wealth is probably increased. If you're a low income earner who work, maybe janitorial services or a waiter, bartender, you might have lost your job 1 or 2 times. And you both sit at the nexus of, fiscal and economic discussions. And how are you conveying that, our income tax revenue might be up, but our sales tax revenue is down. And these workers are doing well, but these aren't, and how that needs to translate into public policy.
Yeah, I'll take my first shot at that, and then John can fill in. One of the things John mentioned earlier, this very easy to see shift from spending on services, which Ohio and a lot of states don't tax, to spending on goods, which we do, has been an interesting pandemic effect that I don't think anyone anticipated going in, but looking back on it, it's like, well, of course. Right? So, and how that affects state revenues, because again, shift of a significant amount of spending to those taxable goods. Now, John also mentioned how budget directors always are looking for, the next downturn, the next negative, so that we can plan for it. I am being very cautious about how we look at those sales tax revenues and thinking about some of those sales taxes as one-time revenues that eventually, as the economy returns, as vaccine rollout continues strong and people get back to normal over the next several months, spending will swing back towards services, and we may see some leveling out of that sales tax revenue. So we have to be prepared for that. We have to think about that now that we saw the upside of that from a state budget perspective. We have to think about, okay, when we get back to normal, how that will look. And so as we are in the budgeting process, we're being very cautious about how we look at one-time revenues for one-time expenses, for one-time surge investments into, that can be helpful towards the future and really fast forward our economic recovery without creating ongoing expectations of spending into the future, because there is still that level of uncertainty ahead.
Yeah, and that's a well-stated question, Richard. One of the issues, that in fiscal policy is, what can government do to support that recovery versus what part of the recovery is going to occur naturally anyway? And so we're not always the best at that, but nor is anybody in terms of predicting the future. And so one of the things the governor has looked at is where do we need a bridge, to get to the post-vaccination recovery? Where do people need rescue and recovery? And then what can we do in investment that not only is just a good use of not only the one-time state dollars, but now the one-time federal dollars that are coming, that really kind of takes us through to that post-pandemic recovery. They're not hard to think about in terms of the options that you have, but you're not sure you're fully making all the right choices, because it's hard to determine where to do that. So do you help individuals? Do you help the businesses who are most affected by that? What do you do on the public sector side? I believe you're going to see a decent amount of spending of the new federal American Rescue Plan Act funds on those infrastructure investments, to the extent that they're allowed. They create immediate construction jobs. Talk about shovel ready. You talk about water and wastewater and broadband, schools. There are plenty of things that like the American Recovery Act, of over 10 years ago. There are things that we can do that immediately create those kinds of positions, but also create an asset that will be returning investment on an ongoing basis. So it's that question of that investment in human capital to get us through that. and assisting, if you will, the private sector in getting back on its feet so it can employ workers. Number one thing we need to do is get people back employed. That is the most stable situation that we can put our citizens in. And so it needs to be targeted because as you opened up, there are sectors who are doing okay or doing well. And then there are sectors who were most affected by the pandemic and may need that help that both the federal government is providing, and the states can supplement and fill in those gaps.
So you both keep answering questions before I can get there, because I do want to ask you about the $350 billion that Congress is set to approve any minute now for state and local governments. And I should mention that I brought on two ringers because I have a former director and a member of the executive committee of the National Association of State Budget Officers. And so one, do you have plans for this money that we think, knock on wood, is now going to show up? Any do's and don'ts? And then, more broadly, since you've both done a good job of kind of addressing that already, how has it been the past year? Because you had Medicaid expansion last February. Well, I shouldn't say that. You had extra Medicaid dollars. Medicaid expansion is something very different. You had extra Medicaid dollars last February. You had money for pandemic-specific, expenditures and CARES. Then you had extra dollars in the December legislation for schools and transportation. And every time state and local aid was in and out, in and out, in and out, how did you prepare for any of this? And how are you now ready for possibly this new infusion of funds that, again, was almost at risk of not showing up?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. The answer is we've been thinking about this ever since the proposal to have state and local aid, it came up. How much of that at the time was necessary, if you will, to maintain the state government public services has now shifted in our state away from how do we best use those funds. I think Governor Polis just crystallized it really well about jobs today, targeted recovery, lasting impacts, return on investment, the highest and best use. And so now it's in our lap right now, and here we are ending our legislative budget process, on the 11th hour. So it really is going to be, a lot of pulling together quickly some plans. And as we all know from the CARES Act money, we got to wait for the guidance to really be able to, to surgically look at the capabilities that, what can we do there? Governor Polis correctly mentioned some of the scope narrowed, with the Senate amendments in terms of flexibility. And we're sure hoping the guidance, as they did with the Federal CARES Act, began to provide some opportunities, a little more flexibility, than originally concerned. So you're right. It's going to be a laboratory of how quickly to budget and dispose of, a large amount of one-time money, in these next few months.
And I would just add to that that we are pleased that these dollars can be used for things like broadband. I mentioned earlier, broadband infrastructure, investing to ensure that all of our citizens have the access that's necessary to be productive, to do a job search, to have a telehealth appointment. Those are all critical, and Ohio has many rural communities where that is still an issue and a need. So that will definitely be part of our focus with these dollars, which, making the most of them, doing things that we wouldn't otherwise have the ability to do, I think is going to be critical. I think it's also, it gives us an opportunity to really plan and reflect, given that these dollars have a little bit longer of a time frame. The CARES Act dollars, especially as the CARES Act was originally constructed, those dollars were available for less than a year. They were extended then in December for another year, but these dollars are available through 2024. So I think we have some time to really assess the situation, look at where we can maximize the impact, look at what are our needs coming out of the pandemic, and what do we need first. Are there things that we need to continue to keep our citizens safe? What can we do to improve our health infrastructure? And again, where can we invest in our communities?
Awesome. So I want to grab a question from our audience. Someone asked if the pandemic and the downturn have affected how you think about rainy day funds, and that could be both in terms of how much a state should be saving or what they are specifically designed to be spent on, whether it's for economic downturns or for natural disasters or unforeseen events.
Well, I'll start. We in Ohio, we have our budget stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, and that is really to ensure that we can keep the basic services of government functioning. And but we always want to first tighten our belts before we access that. And so we were able to get through the downturn last spring without having to spend those one-time resources.
Mm-hmm.
We also budget every single year for emergencies and disasters. So we have an emergency purposes fund and we have a disaster services fund in our budget every year because regardless of the year, there's always some event that arises, some occurrence that you can't
Mm-hmm.
plan for, whether it's, a tornado or a flood or, some other issue like that. So we plan for that regardless. And so we don't think of the rainy day fund, the budget stabilization fund as our, disaster services fund. We think of those separately.
Yeah, I would say that when Governor Beshear, when we came in December, Kentucky had the 46th lowest rainy day fund kind of as a share of general fund. And so based upon, what I was describing earlier and how we ended up the fiscal year 2020 in better position, we were actually able to add what at the time was the largest single addition to our rainy day fund at the end of last fiscal year. And as a part of the governor's plan of using the one-time money, he has proposed, a portion of that to go into the rainy day fund to further build it up while we have this opportunity here. And that has received very good reception so far, we think, on the legislative side. So here we have this situation where we're in a pandemic, and yet we were able to build up our rainy day fund, though it was low. But as to its use, similar to what Kim had said, we do have to use that for our emergency fund. We do not have a separate fund to contend with natural disasters and the match, to FEMA funds. And we're getting ready to use some of that with the flooding, that has happened in Eastern Kentucky. We've had very severe flooding. But we, on a historical basis, we haven't used it very often. During the Great Recession, we cleaned it out, and that was a time to use your rainy day fund.
Mm-hmm.
We did the same thing in the early 2000 recession. But it was never the first thing. It's always one tool in the way to balance a budget, and it was never the majority tool. So we've got a history of being stingy, if you will, with the use of a rainy day fund. And fortunately, we're going to be in a situation we're going to have our best situation that we've had since the early 90s when Kentucky began a rainy day fund. So it has been, I think, held by both executives and legislatures in Kentucky to be something that is similar to last resort.
So, there's so many numbers that are flying around in these conversations about both fiscal and economic policy, but the one that kind of always sticks with me is that we've lost 1.4 million state and local government jobs since January 2020. It's about 7% nationally, which is pretty close to Ohio. I think they're like 7.5, and Kentucky's a little higher at 9% of losing state and local jobs. But even that, that's a number. Are you able to put this into more personal terms in terms of what positions have your state lost? What did that mean when your state had to reduce its number of state and local employees?
Well, in Ohio, we did start the planning for the downturn very early. Again, I mentioned we were paying attention in early February when coronavirus was affecting China and Europe, and we first slowed hiring, and then in March instituted a hiring freeze along with several other budget controls. So we are down at the state level, in state government, about 1,500 total permanent positions. We did that through attrition, though, and we instituted the hiring freeze in a way that it did not impact those positions that were directly working on either the emergency response to the pandemic or the social services response to the pandemic. So when it affected other jobs, but again, it was through attrition. We were able to protect our employees. We did not institute any kind of major across the board layoffs or anything like that. We were very careful and really looking at it. How do we maintain our services? How can we again tighten our belt, make sure that we are as efficient as possible, as productive as possible, but while being conservative in our overall personnel costs.
And John, if I can kind of give you the follow-up question is, when do you think these will return, or hiring will return to where we were pre-pandemic? I know that's a little tough, but do you think we're on track for another sustained, it took us for 10 years to replace the jobs we lost during the Great Recession. Are we in store for that again?
Well, in Kentucky, looking at the numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the bulk of the reductions in both state and local were in the education area. In the state government side, we had tight budgets, and so there was kind of just some natural attrition, but it wasn't a necessity in order to balance the budget. And so talk with some of my post-secondary ed finance people. When I saw that, I said, can you tell me what happened? They don't understand the numbers. They don't understand why the numbers are that low. They don't, they had tight budgets as well. And then they had to deal with, COVID, but there were not. And so my guess is because some of the numbers include temporary part-time employees, that might have been, the lead in some of those reductions. And then on our school districts, same thing. They weren't reducing employees because of the fiscal situation. And so we're a little bit flummoxed, I'll say, about the local education numbers dropping because it doesn't relate directly to the fiscal situation. So I don't have a great answer for you. We did not intentionally, I'll say this, reduce the number of employees in our education sector that was outside of living within, the tight budgets that they already had. And so I don't know about the bounce back, because I'll be honest, we're still not clear about the way the data shows.
Yeah. Awesome. And so we're running out of time, but I would really like to ask this one last question, and I'll make it really hard as a nice send-off, because this is the State of the States event, state budget directors. But I would like to know if you've had any conversations with your local budget officials, because I think I've at least heard the idea that locals are in a different situation because just their revenue systems are different than, the state. And this pandemic is so focused on locals, especially major cities. And is there anything you could share with those conversations, or is there a divergence between state and local budgets right now?
Well, I would say I have had some discussions, at least with our largest city, which is Louisville, and they had some budget difficulties pre-pandemic, right? And so they were already working through a very difficult, fiscal situation prior to that. And so I will say this: the CARES Act money, I think, at the local level, because in Kentucky, not only did you have the big cities getting direct funds, but we provided, over 20+% of ours to local communities. That was really a big help. In fact, I was listening to our second largest city mayor yesterday talk about the budget situation having been assisted greatly by the ability for them to use their funds for police, fire, and those kinds of things, their payroll. So, and also talked with some of our state agency that deals with our rural counties. Their revenue structure is occupational license taxes and property taxes primarily. We do not have local sales taxes in Kentucky, and is so far a pretty good report. in terms of their ability to contend. And again, a number of comments about the CARES Act really being a bridge through the worst times, of their revenue reductions, particularly as it related to, their local income tax. But property taxes, are the most stable of public revenue sources. And property valuations, in our state, like many others, they're not dropping, they're only rising. And so, so I think that was, that helped in terms of the stability of that revenue source to keep their heads above water.
We, in Ohio, I talk with our local government partners on a very regular basis. One of the things that Governor DeWine did at the very start of the pandemic was create a local government strike force. And I'm the convener of that group. So we meet with our county commissioners, mayors, townships, early in the pandemic, twice a week. And then it went to weekly. We're continuing that to meet monthly. And John is right, the CARES Act dollars were absolutely critical for our local governments to bridge those gaps. We in Ohio fully shared our coronavirus relief funds. So our largest city and our largest counties received direct funding from US Treasury, and we shared the dollars that came through the state up to 45% with our local communities as well. So I know that has been helpful. We will continue to work together to ensure that all of our communities are a part of the resurgence that we already see happening here in Ohio. And again, communication has just been key. So we know what issues each other are facing. We can learn from what's happening locally on the ground. It's been critical during the rollout of our vaccine too. Governor DeWine talks with our mayors and our county commissioners. They have provided great feedback to how we can ensure that we're getting the vaccine into our communities so that everyone has a vaccine location close to them, so that we can ensure that there is equity in the rollout and equity in our recovery.
Awesome. Well, Kim and John, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, knowledge, and I know very limited time with us. This was a great pleasure, and I know I learned a lot, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.